Hello and welcome to Copa Independent, the final show of this World Cup, both in the sense of our number of episodes for the tournament and also because, of course, it is about the final, reflecting on it and on Spain's second star. They do feel like the rightful winners, certainly of the final itself. I mean, we're talking about second stars, and they beat what ended up becoming, it felt like a black hole of an Argentina team. But I am, of course, joined here by my colleague, senior football writer Richard Jolly, who's beside me for the game, and to his left, who felt an Argentine fan in the press box, giving some of his responses. But Rich, what's your main impression then of the 23rd World Cup final?
I think, as you say, the best team won the final and the best team won the tournament, and those two things are genuinely positive. But it was really quite a frustrating final in quite a lot of ways. I think we both felt that. Argentina's attitude, Argentina's whole performance was annoying. It was a shame. They didn't have a shot for about 120 minutes. They spent more time, they wasted a lot of people's time, really. They showed the worst aspects of Argentinian football today, whereas in some of the other games, they've shown the best aspects of Argentinian football, both in terms of the quality and using the spirit in the right way. And here today we had the ill discipline, Enzo Fernandez's needless red card, Leandro Paredes blowing up after the final whistle. And if that is Lionel Messi's final World Cup game, as it surely will be, it was actually quite a sad way for him to go. I think he deserved better, even if the rest of the team didn't.
It's a bit of a funny one, that, isn't it? Because usually in these situations, we've actually been discussing this a bit all tournament, how more interesting it is often to talk about the team that loses, but that is mostly because it's definitive, whereas at the final, we usually have talking about the champions and what the significance is, the greater meaning, which we will get into. But it does feel the more interesting topic of debate and discussion is actually Argentina. And as you say, it felt like quite a sour way to end it. A lot of the game just felt like it was a very sour experience. Look, obviously, it's a dream, it's a privilege to go to the World Cup final, despite everything the FIFA tried to turn it into on this occasion. It is the ultimate fixture in football. But this specific iteration of it, I have to say, I think that is the worst final I've attended. That was my fifth. Even 2010, which is actually quite a similar game and kind of ebb and flow, and a Spanish victory and how it ended, it felt more intense than this. And I would have to say, I put it almost exclusively down to Argentina. I mean, they're the first World Cup finalists not to have a shot within 90 minutes. With this, Rich, do you think this is an inevitable consequence of the way they've been playing all tournaments, or just something unique to the occasion, that they couldn't go further, that it's about the opposition they played against? Did they get too revved up for England? Is the issue kind of the team that plays the second semi-final usually loses? I mean, what's your kind of main impression of why that performance was as it was?
I think there's probably several factors, and one is that they had to put so much energy, both physical and emotional, into every game in the knockout rounds. Really, they had quite a nice run of fixtures, and yet somehow Argentina managed to make them such a difficult run, including, going to extra time in the quarterfinal against Switzerland that I went to. But you can also talk about just how good Spain are at controlling a game and suffocating a team. But some of it comes down to mentality as well. And Miguel, you were at the semi-final against England for Argentina, and it felt in the first half they weren't very interested in playing football then. And it was only when they went 1-0 down that they actually concentrated on scoring goals and showed they could. And in this game, they didn't really attempt to score goals again until they conceded. But the difference is that against England, they conceded after about 55 minutes. Here they didn't concede until after about 105 minutes, and by which point they'd already gone down to 10 men, and they'd already got themselves entrenched in that sort of attitude of trying to frustrate. And by that point as well, they'd already brought on the resident hatchet man Paredes and another agent provocateur in Giuliano Simeone.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny as well. Like, maybe Spain actually got their tactics spot on outside not winning in 90 because, or their approach spot on, because they scored just giving Argentina not enough time. Because as you say, a bit like the England game, they finally came to life a bit. Messi was finally on the ball, and when he finally got the ball in the dangerous attacking position, he set up a chance that came from a corner, and then that one big opportunity they had, which is Simeone blazing the ball over the bar. They might have tried a few shots before that. Maybe they'd have found their range a little easier. But I would have been wrong if that went there. I have to say, from about an hour on, and especially when Marino missed that header, just after Nico Williams had the goal disallowed, I just still can't understand why it was disallowed. I felt it was going to be one of those days for Spain on the worst possible day. And I just felt like this is going to penalties. Martinez is going to have an wondershot, and we're going to have the kind of, how to put it, this is the least value World Cup winners in a final of all time. The team that did the least to win it. And just picking up on something else you said there, Rich, I do think that, well, two things from it. We'd obviously been saying all tournaments, a little like with England at that side of the draw, that these were flawed, dysfunctional teams that as soon as they're going to come up against an elite side, they'd lose. And this was probably that. There just weren't many elite sides in the competition. And secondly, that just Spain, for what Argentina do and how little pace they've got, is exactly the wrong team to play. Look, it's a World Cup final. You don't want to reduce everything to kind of a discussion about England. But from speaking to people close to the Spanish camp before the game, they obviously, it's not the sort of thing they would 100% articulate for the fear of kind of things blown up in their face, as I could have done. But I think they very much prefer to play Argentina rather than England, because England had far more weapons than Argentina.
Yeah, and one of the things we saw actually was the number of weapons Spain had. And we've had this kind of situation in the tournament so far where a lot of it has seemed to come down to the outstanding individuals of the best teams. And in a way, Argentina have been the most extreme case of that with Messi. And Spain have been at the other extreme with being the best team. And how they've won a lot of the games has been from not just having the best team, but the best squad. And it's been Miguel Marino who's come off the bench in a couple of games. Here today, Ferran Torres was the one who got the winner. Pedri, I thought, was excellent. I know you thought that as well when he came on. And I thought Nico Williams was the real catalyst. And Spain haven't had him at his best in the tournament because of injury. But he seemed to be ubiquitous when he came on. He set up the goal. He showed one of the things Argentina don't have. Argentina do not have high-quality wingers and have not since Di Maria left. And Spain obviously had Yamal from the start and Williams at the end. But one thing I also wanted to pick up on was when you said talking about Spain as a kind of opponent for Argentina and Argentina's lack of pace. Well, if Spain had lost the semi-final, they'd have lost it to France. And then you'd have had a final of France against Argentina. And would France have beaten Argentina by pace, whereas Spain beat them really much more by control?
And I think that there's something in that as well that you mentioned about like the squad. And like it does point to Spain being a real collective. And there's a lot of elements to that, which I think is why they are good winners as well. I think actually they're probably, almost by virtue of the fact they scored more goals, had more games where they scored more than one goal, they're probably more popular than they were in 2010, even if the boring debate has resurfaced a bit. But you're like, the fact that Ferran Torres, he's been an impact sub for most of this competition, the fact that he scored a win, as you say, it speaks to the depth of their squad, but also the idea of a collective, that it wasn't one of the stars. And there is something in that as well. I mean, obviously, we've talked a lot about the idea that Spain have, how it amplifies what they've got. But like, I've done a piece on this for the morning where apparently there was a phrase doing the round among the Spanish team that was pretty much repeated at a key moment of that game. I think it was around either 90 minutes or the end of the first half extra time, where it was the first time panic was beginning to come into their game a little bit. And they were reminded what Luis Aragonés said to them, sent to the team in 2008, which is basically, calm, you're better. And like, I know that's quite a simple phrase, but it does speak to the idea of trust in the idea and trust in your technique. And I do think this is particularly relevant, especially amid the discussion about England, and all their federations, which is, look, and I don't mean there's a moral dimension to this in terms of kind of good and bad. There is maybe a moral football dimension, though, where you're kind of getting into the stuff that like people like the grandes like Busby and Shankly used to speak about, which is true football bravery, which is basically a trust in your own technique, a willingness to take the ball on your terms and actually do something with it, which I think actually Nico Williams speaks to a lot, given he's willing to get the ball and just run. Same with Yamal, it was pretty much kind of double marked throughout the game. And it just makes such a difference. And that, even if you don't like what the Spanish idea produces as a whole, the core of it is still basically trust your technique, trust your willingness to have the ball, trust your own approach, which I think there is a bit of a lesson there beyond all the lessons you can take about kind of Spanish coaching and all this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you'd probably say that Spain probably have the most defined style of play of any international team at the moment. And that's probably helped as well by having a coach in De La Fuente who's worked with a lot of these players at the youth system and has come through that way. And it's the complete opposite to the approach England took and Brazil took with Ancelotti, as well as to trying to bolt on a supposed winner of a coach and imagine that would be the thing that made the difference. And in terms of Spain's strength in depth, I think part of that relates to the style of play, in that some of these players can come into the team and maybe almost look better players than they are, whereas sometimes with other international teams, they look less than the sum of their parts. I mean, Pedro Porro, who's just come 17th in the Premier League in the last 2 seasons, and I think has been the best right-back in this World Cup. And that's a case in point. And you see that with quite a few Spain players. And I think one of the other things with Spain is there has been some continuity since the last Euros. There's also been some players who've gone out and some others who've come in. 2 years ago, it was Alvaro Morata, it was Dani Carvajal, it was Danny Heulian, I think, at the back. Other players have come in, and it's felt quite seamless, which I think does point to a style of play and also a unity within the camp that works. And it does in turn suggest that in 2 years' time it could work as well. Partly, of course, because this is not an old team. I mean, Yamal in particular is not an old player, but it's not an old team. But it does suggest that if 2 or 3 players lose form or get injured or something else happens, that it should be more possible for Spain to slot someone else into their stead.
Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it, with Yamal? I mean, he's won the World Cup before the age of 20 and he'll feel he has unfinished business in the competition. He could have scored twice today. There was that chance early on and in that free kick. I think Argentina generally did a good job on him. But you mentioned something there, Rich, as well, about kind of, I suppose, players being able to slot in. And that's also something else that this team actually defines much more even than the kind of dominant team of 2008 to 2012, which is the coach, Luis De la Fuente, has basically had, I think it's almost the entire squad, maybe bar Yamal because he was trained to the seniors, in youth teams. I mean, Rodri won the under-19 Euros with De La Fuente back in 2015, and they just won it again in Wales, like so it's the next off the conveyor belt. And that means it's beyond an idea, because the players know the idea intimately and they pretty much know each other intimately. Like De La Fuente knows all these lads' their families, like for over a decade now. And just like the team in 2010, there'll be ebbs and flows. But I think there has been an evolution in Spanish coaching as well, where they talk about how the kind of that possession pressing style, there is more intensity to it, that it's evolving. You see it in more of these young players coming through. As you said, the age profile is very good. They will fancy being in good shape for what is a home World Cup, although the host city for the final hasn't been announced yet. It could be in Casablanca or rather than Madrid, but they'll be fancying that, and like they'll be fancying going on and winning more, something that De La Fuente picked up on after the game. And that is something that I think other countries are going to have to pick up on. And there's a fascinating one there, because obviously when Spain won the World Cup in 2010, it obviously created a wave where UEFA have these kind of study groups. It's now called UEFA Share, where essentially federations come together and they're actually quite collegiate and share ideas, what you're doing, what we're doing, how you can develop. And obviously around that period in 2013 in particular, everyone was going to Spain, and the FA were especially interested. And that's essentially the genesis of the St. George's Park project. And well, the genesis, they were always like, that's some of that goes into the England DNA, except on the Spanish side, they did keep some of it back, which is essentially the quality of their grassroots coaching, really, and something you can't really create in the same way. That all of these players grow up playing small or organic, small space, small sided games in the street, and that's then institutionalized. But they felt that the FA, they were concentrated too much on structural issues rather than the actual football detail. And it's hard not to think that does translate into the great difference between England and Spain in this competition, which is basically Spain being able to play like that against Argentina and England just completely retreating in their semi-final. And this, even though I do think Tuchel was at fault with the approach he had and the subs he made, obviously some of that itself is a consequence of the context of players just not being able to keep the ball like Spanish players.
Yeah, and you talked earlier about how some people thought Spain were boring in 2010, and I'm one of them, to be honest. I felt that team in 2010 was probably technically even better than this one. They had even more good passers, but they took an idea to an extreme. This team, I think, has a bit more varied attributes, having the two wingers when Williams is on the pitch. They only often had one when it was Yamal and Alex Baena on the other flank, but having a number 10 in Dani Olmo as well, having a striker in Miguel Oyarzabal. So they've actually got a really nice blend of attributes whereas the 2010 team, I would argue, were a bit too one-dimensional, even if they were incredible at that dimension. But one thing I felt generally about the tournament as a whole, and I don't know whether you would agree or disagree with, is that Spain have been really good in a time at the moment where there aren't that many really good international teams. Now, I think in a way, I felt France were the second best team in the tournament, even though they came fourth. But when you look at a lot of the other teams, I think you and I both feel Argentina were not as good as they were 4 years ago. They still ended up in the final again. It felt that a lot of the middle ranking teams have got better, but there's not too many great teams out there. And there were a lot of teams there who you looked at and thought was a last 16 team or a last 8 team. But there weren't really that many teams you thought that, compared to in some previous World Cups, that you really wanted to see in a semi-final or a final. And so the average level of teams has probably risen, I would say, but there's not as many great teams in the past. And if that does, I would suggest, mean if Spain can keep up this level, that positions them very well for the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, from that, because it's a final tends to dictate the larger memory of a tournament. Where does this World Cup stand for you? Hey, I mean, before we get into kind of a lot of the day's events and what it says in a bigger sense, what's your main impression with this World Cup? Mine, I have to say, is it was a good World Cup. It was entertaining throughout, and even the final, as sour as it was as a game, it's the final, so it always has a tension of its own. But on the whole, most of the best football was in forgettable stages, like the groups. There were some good storylines there, and in the end, it didn't go to the peaks necessary in the knockouts, and it really mattered. And in that, actually, there was a few parallels with USA 94, which is a great open attacking tournament, and then sort of dwindled towards the end.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, I slightly perversely have 94 as my favourite World Cup, even though it had a terrible final. I would argue 94 had more good games and more really good drama in the knockouts. I think with this World Cup compared to the last one, you've obviously got the massive difference of a brilliant final in 2022 and really not a brilliant final this time around. I don't think 2022 was actually a great World Cup, but I think people will remember it very, very fondly because of the final. This one, I think it will be remembered in part as sort of the tournament of some of the outstanding individuals, which I think probably suits both FIFA and American culture to have Messi and Mbappe and Haaland and Kane and Bellingham and Dembele all scoring 6, 7, 8, 10 goals. But in terms of the knockout stages, were they incredible? I don't think so. There was some of the best games were ones that almost produced shocks. You might have been at both of Argentina's games against Egypt and Cape Verde. For me personally, I was at Norway versus Brazil. That was a real highlight of mine. And Croatia versus Portugal, I think, was probably my other real highlight. But yeah, I'd probably put it as good rather than great as a World Cup. And in part, that's maybe because there weren't enough real top teams. And also, you got one or two shocks, like the aforementioned Norway versus Brazil. It didn't quite lead to someone going even further. You know, if Norway had beaten England, which arguably they'd have deserved to, maybe in a way that would have made a better World Cup.
Yeah, I'm probably the same thinking that. And even, I'm trying to think, as you were speaking there, I was trying to think of the best games I was at. England-Mexico was good, but I do wonder now how much of that was just amplified by the emotion of the Azteca and what it is. Because actually, I do remember thinking of that game, like I know it was such a big thing for England, but I didn't think Mexico were going to score in the last 20 minutes. I just couldn't see it. I thought Argentina-Egypt was better as a game and probably the best I was at. Although Argentina-England, like obviously it's the fixture of maybe the richest history in this World Cup in terms of its epic games. It never got close to the heights of 1986, obviously, or 1998. But it did have an epic quality due to the way it ended and the storylines to it. And like that was possibly a World Cup classic in that sense, even if it was one that obviously English people won't need to or won't want to look back on again. To reiterate this, because the final ended up being overseen by two coaches who are federation men. It's something we've discussed already. And I do have to reiterate, I think it is a good thing in the long run for English football that they haven't won just by parachuting in a very expensive coach. Although it doesn't sound like, unfortunately, it's going to happen for now. But English football should be looking at, it doesn't have to be an idea like Spain, but the FA should be wanting an English team to play with an English identity within a modern context. Something that's based on aggression, intensity, pressing. Like the classic English values that when people from abroad do come to English football, that they really appreciate. And they're like, it doesn't feel like, it feels they're besotted with Tuchel, which is understandable to a degree, but I have to say, I think the spell could be broken there. And that should be the lesson that the FA take from this. And it should be a lesson, I think, that other federations take too.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting question in terms of Tuchel and the English identity, because I think he almost got too hung up on Premier League pace and Premier League intensity when he picked the squad, and when he then left out some of the technical players. But then it seemed for him it was going to be all about fast wingers, and when Gordon comes off, Rashford comes on, and when Saka comes off, Madueke comes on, until suddenly he went into this plan B of just retreat, and it meant that when Gordon comes off, actually it's Ezri Konsa who comes on. But in terms of your broader point, I agree. I think both you and I would have preferred it if Lee Carsley had got the England job, and I don't think that's us being revisionist, because I think we probably both would have preferred it at the time. And when you look at De La Fuente and you look at Scaloni and you look at their knowledge of the players that they've got, that does seem hugely beneficial. And when you look at the countries who have tried to import a manager at great expense, it's been with really mixed results. And even going back in World Cup history, there's some great examples of imported managers doing really well, but sometimes they're with different types of countries in different positions. I'm thinking of Gus Hiddink with South Korea in 2002, which is a sort of very different situation to England right now. And you can see why South Korea then would want someone like Hiddink, when Japan then would want someone like Philippe Trizier to make a difference. And these days, the leading footballing nations, actually some of the managers who have worked there have had some form of longevity. They've known the players. Sometimes they haven't had a great club record. I mean, you look at Jogi Löw with Germany, you look at Deschamps with France. Obviously with Löw towards the end, he outstayed his welcome, but for a long time it was very successful. And that does seem to be the formula that actually works, rather than just simply saying, this guy's won the Champions League. Well, maybe he has, but I think international football and club football seem maybe more different than before.
Yeah, I think it was a World Cup that really emphasised exactly that. And that's almost the main lesson I would take. I think international football has been diverging down a different path for some time. I think that was really made clear here, with the irony, of course, that Spain are the closest to a club team. But I think that's a different sort of thing, because what they do is so rare. And I don't think other countries can replicate it in the same way without deep thought, even if they should take lessons off Spain. But yeah, there are. And this is the thing, is about, if it is going down a different path, I think it's now become, there's an onus on other countries to actually think about how they grapple with that. And it does feel like the lesson isn't, well, this guy's won a. I mean, I have to say, it was always the one thing I thought about the Tuchel thing. And I like Tuchel personally. I think he's obviously an excellent coach. But this almost simplistic thinking, well, he's got a good record in knockouts, the knockouts being all club games. Like, let's just bolt that on. It does feel a little bit basic in terms of how that works. And there's a real irony to that, because as you're speaking there, I wonder how, like, in a strange way, I would say England could be more satisfied with the 1998 World Cup than this one, just because there was more of a character to their performance and the way they went out, and it left a more lasting image than what this does, which feels slightly confused, right down to that weird third and fourth place playoff, which I wouldn't actually read too much into, but it does play into all this.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? In that officially it's England's second most successful World Cup and their most successful one abroad anywhere. And yet I would put it below 1990 and below 2018. And I don't think, and also below Euro 1996 for another issue. I don't think it'll be remembered anything like as fondly as those, because those had some real high points in terms of breakthrough moments, in terms of good football, in terms of an overall feel. This one, I do think, is a missed opportunity. And even going back to what you're saying about not reading too much about into the third and fourth playoff, but one thing you maybe can read into it is that, well, Bukayo Saka's a really good player. And that maybe he should have actually come onto the pitch at some point against Argentina. I mean, clearly the Argentina game was never going to be the same as the France game. It was never going to be 6-4. But watching Saka and Rashford in the first half in that game, and remembering that Saka didn't get a minute against Argentina and Rashford got about 2 at the end, it did show that this is actually a more talented England squad than some in the past. And one of the reasons why I think England really shouldn't have regrets about 2018 is that was a team that I felt went further than was logical. And yes, they lost the semi-final, and you can look at things and say, yes, it got away from the second half when Luka Modric and Brozovic and Rakitic got on the ball. But realistically, when they did, they were going to be better on the ball than England. This was against an Argentina team whose flaws we saw a bit against Spain when England had a lead. This was the one that really could have been quite a lot better. And this is probably going to be the only World Cup when England have both Kane and Bellingham at their peak. And even though England do produce a lot of players, as with most countries, you don't have an equal distribution of them around the pitch. So in 4 years' time, they might not get the chance again, and it might end up being England's best chance for a long time to reach a World Cup final. And so I think, a bit of a missed opportunity as a tournament rather than something to celebrate.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, it was my feel like there's been a bit doing the rounds now about, what are people complaining about? Tuchel's got, as you say, statistically the second best English World Cup of all time, but he wasn't employed to do that. Like it's a bit too easy forgotten. The parameters by Tuchel himself and by the FA were to win, to go the distance. Because, I mean, like, getting to a semi-final is nothing new anymore. This was England's 4th in the 5 tournaments. And he didn't. And that's why I think there's a bit of a unwarranted glow, because England, there's most of the resources are all there now. There's a final piece missing that Tuchel was supposed to represent. And he evidently wasn't that. And I do agree with you. I mean, look, they mightn't have beaten Spain in the final, but it'd be nice to have the chance. And also, it's a final, it's a one-off. Look how close what was ultimately a dysfunctional and tired Argentina came to actually kind of forcing penalties, or maybe a bit more. But actually, just one final point on Spain. One thing that really stood out for me from their overall performance was there was a few moments in that game where suddenly, like obviously they're dominating most of it, then suddenly the ball breaks up. There's a player running through. And there's a weird thing in those sort of situations that we used to see in Spanish teams in the past. And we've even seen in Pep Guardiola teams where, because they're so dominant, one simple break can sometimes expose a glass jaw and create panic. With this, that didn't happen at all for Spain. They were so calm, I think, which speaks to that approach. I mean, look, it's a difference where, in contrast to the 2010 final, when it's Arjen Robben running through on goal rather than Simeone. But I think it again speaks to kind of what this Spanish side were in terms of, just speaking to this idea that has ultimately won it and feels above the rest of the game in this competition. But just, I suppose, to finish up then, as we're speaking on this podcast, I can obviously see myself on the screen. I can see my sunburn, which is a direct consequence of FIFA and the US Secret Service, because we were made to wait out in a queue of 2.5 hours. I understand it was the same for fans, because Secret Service had to check everyone going in. It didn't feel very well prepared. It did create, I think, for a lot of media and for fans, from what I'm told, who went, it soured the experience initially a bit, maybe to fit with the game. And yet that still was not as bad an experience as that Justin Bieber song at halftime, the really slow one, in that awful halftime show, which I think is an anti-football abomination. Leaving aside the game, what was your general experience or your general feeling of the day, Rich?
Well, I felt it was probably the worst organised game I've ever been at in terms of my own personal experience. And I've covered over 2,000 matches, plus a few in one or two other sports. But And some of that clearly is down to the US Secret Service. Some of that is due to FIFA. Some of that is down to the absolute chaos at the ground, which may or may not be the consequence of the MetLife staff, may or may not be the consequence of whoever's doing whatever things. And there were a lot of things that did not work today. I mean, clearly one of the things that should be set in stone is if Donald Trump is going to delay everyone by 2 hours, he shouldn't be there. It's as simple as that. And there were other political leaders there. Mark Carney was there. Claudia Scheinbaum was there. As far as we're aware, Secret Service didn't really care what happened to any of them. But, you know, when you've got 80,000 people at a ground being delayed for 2 hours because of a man who isn't very interested in football at all and who just wants a photo opportunity, he should not be there. This World Cup, I think a lot of it has not been well organised at various host venues. You and I have rarely been in the same place at the same time, so your experiences might have been different to mine or similar, but just in different places. A lot of it has not been well organised. FIFA have not been competent in a lot of things. In this instance, it did feel as though the Secret Service were the initial cause, but it was then compounded by FIFA getting a lot of things wrong. And it did feel as though even though they'd had 4 years to prepare for a World Cup final, they were not prepared at all. Really, some really basic things went wrong from a media perspective. I presume they did from a lot of other people's perspectives. The halftime show was just rubbish. It was absolute rubbish. I think Wayne Rooney's review on the BBC was probably quite succinct. Like a lot of things, like the hydration breaks, it shouldn't be there in the future. It's not what the game is about. The game, we haven't come to see the halftime show. We haven't come to see the millions of celebrities in the crowd. We haven't come to see the big screen panning to them. We haven't come to see Trump or Infantino. We've come to see the football. FIFA needs to remember that. FIFA needs a moral reboot. Part of the problem is so does the United States. Because if this World Cup had been held anywhere else, there would have been less celebrities, but there would have been also less celebrities appearing on the big screen. And maybe if this World Cup had been held somewhere else, we wouldn't have had Justin Bieber to begin with. So this is clearly my argument to go back to Qatar if it gets rid of Justin Bieber.
I mean, just in a very simple illustration of that, I think there was one moment in the game where something happened and I wanted to see a replay because there weren't actually many replay screens. But one of the good things about American stadiums is they have massive screens everywhere. And I thought, okay, I'll just look up at the screen and see, surely they'll show this moment. No, they're showing Tom Cruise or someone. And it just was throughout. Although one of my favourite moments of the day was when Tom Cruise was inexplicably doing some speech on the pitch and the Argentina fans just started singing over him. But just like in terms of the organisation, an impression I had, it was a bit too of an unwieldy World Cup, which was actually almost kind of symbolised in the massive distances that certain stadiums were outside stadiums, or say outside cities, like Boston being an illustration. It always felt such a blessing when a stadium was actually downtown when you could walk to it. And I know it was better for the atmosphere. Like Atlanta ended up being one of my favourite places because of that. I think you were similar with Seattle. And connected to that as well, it was just too long. Like, I mean, stuff like Scotland against Brazil, I was at the game, that feels like it was in a different tournament. And that does actually start to kind of erode what is one of the great things about an international tournament and World Cups, is like its self-contained nature, where suddenly if it's kind of stretching and spreading out, it doesn't feel like... And someone made this point to me today, that game, given Spain weren't at their best, given Argentina obviously weren't, that was actually arguably an illustration that an 8th game is one game too long. In the same way, this stretching to over 5 weeks is a week too long for an international tournament.
Yeah, I'd agree on quite a lot of that. I mean, I think the 48-team format, I think we're stuck with it unless they raise it to 64, which looks likely. I think a lot of what might be termed the extra 16 countries provided some of the colour and some of the flavour in the early stages, but ultimately there just wasn't enough jeopardy in the group stage at all. I mean, to refer to Scotland, I mean, I did Scotland's win over Haiti and the atmosphere was incredible and the Scotland fans were brilliant. But go back to the group stages 4 years ago and they were better because they had that jeopardy of good teams either getting knocked out or potentially getting knocked out. In terms of what you're talking about of like venues, I mean, I agree. I mean, I didn't actually get to Seattle in this one, but I went to Toronto where it was a downtown stadium and that was that was one of my favourite games, in part because Toronto's a great city and it was a good game, but also just the location, everything felt perfect about that. And it seemed to me that when FIFA and presumably the Americans picked their host cities, they didn't consider any of this. They didn't consider some of the basics. Boston would have been a perfect host city if the ground had been in Boston. It wasn't remotely near Boston. It's nearer Providence. So it felt like, I think, only 3 possibly US grounds were anything remotely city central, which I would say Seattle, Atlanta, Philadelphia. One of the great missed opportunities was to not have the World Cup in Chicago, where Soldier Field is right by Lake Michigan near the city centre. And instead, Kansas City, they tried, but the ground is nowhere near the centre of Kansas City. The place has no infrastructure. You and I both went to Dallas. That ground's not in Dallas. It's not particularly near Dallas. And I think Miami was even worse. And this does tap into some fundamental American issues with public transport, which is even more important in an international tournament. But some of the logistics of it didn't work. And yes, the tournament ultimately was too long. I would rather go back to a 32-team one. It won't happen.
Yeah, basically, because that means losing political votes. I mean, and in that context, I think if you've got 48, you may as well have 64 because it would be the same lengths and it's also cleaner. But I think you've touched on something there as well, which is almost one of my main impressions. And I can feel, and this, like, it evolves from the fan experience. And look, we should stress, elements of the US are great. We're saying this as people who actually enjoy coming to the country. I obviously especially love New York among other cities. I suppose it's how the fan experience, or in our case, the journalist experience in attending, was just made needlessly kind of difficult at times. Some of that from FIFA organisations, some of that from general logistics and how US society is constructed. And the classic being, most of America, you need a car. And you're inviting to the world to your event here where they can't have a car and there wasn't enough put on to get around that. And there's something else from that, because I think that is a point of tension for the future, because it does feel like FIFA are like essentially they're anchoring or they're moving the centre of the game away from the match going fan to something more. I think that event that we were at spoke to in terms of like what it was as an entertainment culture. But also there have been so many, I think, troubling precedents from the World Cup that FIFA should notionally be trying to safeguard the game against. And instead they're actually the ones to usher through. One being obviously ticket prices. Another being this episode with Balogun, which I think is that could have real long-term repercussions in the way it potentially starts to erode the legitimacy of the sport as it's run, and like opening this new world where decisions don't end with the referee and end with the kind of white lines of the pitch. And then of course the half-time break, which, you know, like literally breaks the rules of the sport. And again, it's FIFA pushing all this through.
FIFA in many ways have had a terrible World Cup whilst also having an incredibly profitable World Cup. It's done a lot of damage for their standing, and yet it does feel, and you're closer connected than I am with FIFA politics, but it does feel as though Infantino will be comfortably re-elected and that whatever they want to do goes through. But it was interesting, the level of pushback from UEFA, for instance, on the UEFA statement about the Balogun ban, I thought that surprised me, and it actually impressed me. And it does feel as though there is a bit of a battle for the soul of the game going on. And I'm not saying that UEFA are automatically the good guys, but they're not as bad as FIFA. And in terms of the whole ethos of a tournament, I liked the ethos of Euro 2024 a lot more. The ticket prices were a lot more reasonable. There was a really good feel around a lot of it. Deutsche Bahn weren't perfect, but on the other hand, people could get in and out of stadia. Obviously, Germany is a very different country to the United States and it's nowhere near as big. But I think FIFA could look at Euro 2024 and they ought to learn quite a lot. I don't think they will. I think they'd look at it and say, we made far more money than that. But Euro 2024, to me, was a tournament I liked a lot more in terms of off the field, I would say, in terms of a general atmosphere, in terms of the ethos behind it. And this one, I didn't like a lot of the off the field stuff at all.
As you say, diverging down different paths, which it feels like is almost a theme for this tournament, especially given how large the landmass is. And on that, I suppose we'll bring our final show for this World Cup to a close. We will be taking a break until the club season starts. I think, to be honest, we need a bit of a break ourselves. It's been a long 6 weeks with a lot of travel, but it's been a hugely enjoyable experience. Thanks, especially doing this podcast, and for an increasingly loyal audience of listeners. So we thank you all for tuning in. I hope you'll join us again soon. I'll express my thanks to the entire Independent team, including Rich, obviously, producer Jamie, all the guys that have been on it, the entire Independent backroom staff and the wider team. And thank you for listening to us. It is part of the wider Independent podcast network. And once again, thank you. Thanks for enjoying this World Cup with us and occasionally complaining about it. The two sides of the tournament and one final word to go. Thank you.